Hey everyone. Hey. It's good to see you again. Before we start, if you'll just join me in prayer. May the words from my lips touch your spirit and be pleasing to our Creator. So, today I'd like to share a few of my thoughts on fear throughout the Bible and what it means for us. Oftentimes, it can seem like fear is at odds with some of the more positive emotions that we associate with religion, like love or peace. And I wanted to look into that. As you know, today's Bible reading is from Mark 4, where Jesus calms the storm. Jesus first tells the disciples to set off on the Sea of Galilee. Then a storm kicks up, and the disciples are afraid. Jesus calms the storm, and the disciples are afraid again. So, the first time I read this, one thing that really stood out to me was the two separate times that the disciples were afraid. The first time seems pretty understandable. The disciples were afraid for their lives and their physical security. They just didn't want to drown. The second time, however, it was Jesus calming the storm that caused them to be fearful. So, why does the presence of the storm make them fearful, but then its absence also make them fearful? Now, the fear of God as a virtue is a concept that is present in many world religions. In Islam, this concept is represented by the Arabic word taqwa. Literally, it means to shield or to protect, and it is generally translated to be wary of God, to know your place, to have respect for God. And in our own tradition, this concept is also deeply ingrained. The introduction to the book of Proverbs, a book about how to secure wisdom, states that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, let's take a look at that. It's clear that to the Proverbs writers, they are implying that fearing God is foundational in forming our worldview. From it, all knowledge grows. It is essentially saying that fearing God is so important that it informs everything else we can ever learn. But what kind of fear are we talking about here? The storm fear or the calming the storm fear? Now, in Hebrew, the words used are yirat Adonai, which in this context refer to reverential awe of the Lord. This passage is saying that to be reverent of God is such a universal truth that without it, you cannot have an accurate view of the world. So, why is this knowledge important? Consider. We know that God is almighty, that God could do anything. We also know that God is sovereign, and we can't control God. That means that when our desires and our will run opposed to God's will, we find ourselves in the path of something we have absolutely no control over. It's natural that this would lead to fear and reverence of God. In the face of God, we are completely powerless, and that's scary. Fear and awe of God is a natural response to God's power and sovereignty. So if we don't have this fear and awe of God, we don't have this accurate view of God. Now, I think it's pretty clear that the disciples were experiencing this awe of God after Jesus calms the storm. The storm, a primal force that left them helpless, was defeated with just a snap of Jesus' fingers. In a way, the primal and uncontrollable nature of the storm was transferred to Jesus when he calmed the storm. If this storm is so powerful and so great, Jesus must be even more powerful and more great. In Mark's gospel, this is the first example of Jesus performing a truly superhuman feat. We have small healings and other miracles, casting out spirits, but this is the greatest spectacle so far. It also harkens back to important religious figures in Israel's history. Having power over nature, specifically savage bodies of water, reminds the reader of Moses parting the Red Sea, or of Joshua parting the Jordan. In fact, Psalm 107 contains a very similar story. It gives examples of times that God has saved people from calamity, including an example of God calming a stormy sea. It reads, "Some went out on the sea in ships, They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens, and they went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and they sat like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. That's Psalm 107, verses 23 to 27. These parallels would not have been lost on the disciples, nor to the readers of Mark's gospel. For the disciples, it was the first time that they were really forced to confront Jesus' divine power, and they reacted to this with fear and awe. Now, this is not the first time the disciples were fearful in the story. Earlier, before Jesus calmed the storm, the disciples were afraid of it and they woke Jesus. Now, on the first pass, this might appear to simply be fear of the storm, but we can also see some fear and terror of God in it. Jesus was the one who charged them to go onto the sea and into the storm. When the disciples wake Jesus, they do so by saying, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" They are accusing Jesus of deserting them, of leading them into danger and then leaving them alone to die. This is another type of divine fear, terror at what God is actively doing. Being in awe of God acknowledges the potential for God to pursue ends that are at odds with your own. However, terror of God is a reaction to what God is doing or what God has done. Now, we see this terror of God many times throughout the Bible. A prominent example of this is in the book of Job. Now, Job is a rich and a righteous man who loves God and serves him well. Now, Satan is claiming that Job is only righteous because he is wealthy, because he has so much, and that if his wealth and his family and his health were taken away from him, that Job would hate God. The Hebrew word Satan translates to the adversary. When we talk about Satan in this context, we're not referring to a demon with horns and a pitchfork, but something more like a divine prosecutor. Satan's interests run contrary to humans for sure, but his actions are condoned by God. Anyhow, Job loses everything he has, but still refuses to curse God. The majority of this book is told through an argument in verse between Job and three of his friends. Job's friends repeatedly argue that Job is being justly punished for his sins, and they even try to come up with examples for what he might have done. Job repeatedly refutes them, insisting that he is innocent, that God has deserted him, and God isn't playing by the rules. These arguments turn to accusations at God, claiming essentially that God is hiding and shirking the responsibilities. At one point, Job says, "But he stands alone, and who can oppose him? He does whatever he pleases. He carries out his decree against me, and many such plans he still has in store. This is why I am terrified before him. When I think of all this, I fear him." That's Job 23, verses 13 through 15. Throughout his strife, it's important to note that Job never actually curses God. This is something emphasized multiple times. He's complaining, rather, about a mistake, a divine error, and he's not claiming that God is fundamentally unjust. However, his view of God's justice is turned on its head when he's confronted by God and recants. Job is forced to conclude that he can't understand or put limits around God's justice. And in the end, God gives Job twice as much as what he once had. We can see several parallels between the fears of Job and that of the disciples. Both believe that God has deserted them, but more specifically, that he isn't fulfilling the responsibilities that God needs to fulfill. In both cases, God chastises the followers for their lack of trust and ends up making things right. Still, even this narrative is a little confusing. Why would God neglect the responsibilities of divine justice, but then eventually come back and fulfill them? You just heard an excerpt from one of psychologist Abraham Maslow's lesser-known papers, The Need to Know and the Fear of Knowing. He's more famous for his hierarchy of needs, essentially saying you need to have basic needs like health and security before you can have higher intellectual needs. In this lesser-known paper, he argues that humans have an innate curiosity and desire to learn, but that they're afraid of the changes that this new knowledge might bring. Essentially, people are being torn in two opposing directions. In the excerpt we heard today, Maslow says that to discover oneself in a great talent can certainly bring exhilaration, but it also brings the fears and dangers and responsibilities of being a leader and being all alone. In both of the stories we looked at today, the frightened followers have seemingly been deserted by God. When God doesn't respond to their pleas, they are forced to take responsibility over their situation and thus to grow. Ultimately, these changes and these responsibilities that they're forced to undertake, the disciples navigating the storm and Job reconciling his view of divine justice, force them to grow, and that causes them terror and they call out for God. But God is grumpy in both cases. Why? Because the whole point of leaving the followers was to promote change. God was taking the training wheels off, so to speak, and then catching the followers when they inevitably fell. Part of being terrified of God was due to the fear of growth that the followers had. They resented God for forcing them to assume responsibility. As humans, we often react with fear to God's challenges to us, whether it be navigating a literal storm or surviving disease and loss. Now, when we look at the Bible as a whole, we can often see this pattern of God prodding people towards growth and living better lives, where it's almost always faced by apprehension and resistance. One of the most prevalent examples of this is in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is set immediately after Jesus ascends into heaven and documents the history of the early church. It is essentially trying to answer the question, what do we do now that Jesus is gone? What does the church look like? How do we behave? Like Job and the disciples, the early church leaders have been deserted by God and they have to lead the church by themselves. However, the apostles aren't completely alone. The Spirit of God shows up to nudge them in the right direction, and often one that they don't want to pursue. Two brief examples of this. First, in Acts 1, the apostles ask Jesus if he will restore Israel. Right now, the nation of Israel is under Roman occupation, right? They're being oppressed. They want to rise up and they throw off the boot of empire. Jesus says, yes, yes, you will receive power. During Pentecost, however, it's revealed that the power that's coming isn't the military power that the apostles want to overthrow Rome, but rather the power to communicate and reach out towards others. They're given the ability to communicate with people regardless of language. God is doing this her way, not the way that the apostles want. Later, in Acts 9, God tells Ananias to go pray over Saul, or Paul, of Tarsus. Ananias is skeptical because Saul has persecuted many in the early church, but God is insistent, and Ananias goes to Saul. Now, this leads to Saul being baptized and beginning his ministry. If Ananias had had his way, we wouldn't have a quarter of our New Testament. Again, we see the Spirit working in ways that seem surprising and even dangerous to the apostles. The book of Acts is commonly used as a benchmark for how the modern church should behave. So, what can we take away from these two stories? First of all, be in awe of God's autonomy. It's very easy to view God as a yes man, as something to back up your arguments. We see this even in the book of Job. Job is an upright, a faithful, and a righteous man who loves and fears God. And yet, he still tries to confine God to a narrow set of rules of retributive justice. This type of behavior blinds us to the work that God is trying to do through us. The book of Job teaches that God is incomprehensible. Trying to understand God is equivalent to trying to control God, to bind God to one specific worldview. Second, we know that to have courage when God sends you into stormy seas. Service of the Lord often requires taking risks. whether it be rejecting societal values, putting yourself in harm's way physically or emotionally. One can see this with prison chaplains or healthcare workers during the COVID pandemic or student activists. We need to remember that God is waiting on the sidelines to support us in our struggles and to have faith when the way to follow God seems frightening. Finally, and most importantly, we need to be open to God making change in our lives. It's so easy to fall into an easy routine, into a status quo, and forget our purpose. The Spirit is alive and restless in the world. Be open to His and will, instead of binded to our own ways. Proverbs teaches that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and may your fear lead you to awe, courage, and growth. Amen.